Hello everyone. In previous video we have talked about current state of long-term rental in Budapest and some other major Hungarian cities. Overall, we have tried to understand if this particular market recovered after 2020. And if yes, then how well did it recover after harsh and dramatic pandemic year, where rental market was struggling very much. Because, as I mentioned in previous video, long-term rental market is also highly dependent on foreigners here in Budapest. In this case, not tourists, but rather on those foreigners who live here longer, such as students, specialists working in local offices of various companies, and so on. And as we saw, including prices of rentals and demand for rental apartments themselves, local long-term rental market currently doing very well. And that is great news for investors who bought apartments to rent them. And overall, we can say that long-term rental market in Budapest currently doing as good as in pre-pandemic period. But as you remember, beside long-term rental in Budapest, there is a short-term rental too, which is as important as long-term rental in local rental market. And today we will talk with you specifically about this type of rental here, and we'll try to understand the current state of this rental market in September 2022. Just letting you know that September is still a season here. If we talk about short-term rental, there is still a lot of tourists visiting the city in this month. So overall, we will see how well recovered this particular rental here after pandemic year of 2020, when this market almost stopped to exist, and which caused huge damage for investors who used their properties here specifically for short-term rental. As I mentioned you earlier, short-term rental in Budapest is a very important part of Budapest's rental market because a lot of rental apartments are used specifically for this type of rental, that is rented to tourists and guests of the city. The more tourists and guests visiting the city, the more profitable short-term rental is. And as you may know already, Budapest is very beautiful and attractive city, and more tourists coming here every year. Also, apartments are the second most popular type of accommodation where tourists are staying in Budapest, after hotels. We can see these data for each month specifically, what we will do later below, but overall apartments share about 30% of the market after hotels, which share about 50% of the market in accommodation, in market of accommodation. So now let's see how does look the overall picture of short-term rental in Budapest in 2022. In order to have precise data and indexes, we will use data and statistics from Hungarian Tourist Agency. This is centralized and official authority that has access to all registered apartments and hotels and hostels or any different kind of accommodation that serves tourists in Hungary, without any exception. And nowadays, actually, everyone running this kind of rental, that is short-term rental, should register their accommodations in this platform, and it is obligatory for everyone. So let's start our overview of touristic Budapest from April, because the season basically starts from this month in Budapest. Sometimes in March there can be decent amount of tourists too in Budapest. but it depends on how favorable this month in terms of weather conditions. Because sometimes here March can be warm and very pleasant, but sometimes not really. So yes, it depends on weather too, how many tourists visit Budapest in a certain year. Usually touristic season starts in mid-March, and depending on weather, it ends in October. But there are some particular time frame in winter months too. The apartments are in high demand. It is basically entire December and until early January, which is Christmas period, and after that a New Year Eve. But now let's start with April of 2022, and we can see that there were about 300,000 visitors in Budapest in April, which is a slight increase from the March, but very significant increase compared to April 2021 for about 850%. We can also see here that 81% of visitors were foreigners, which is not a surprise, I guess, for you too, and 19% were Hungarian. Earlier I mentioned about how popular apartments are among guests. So here we can see that 35% of guests preferred apartments, which is the second most popular type of accommodation, as I mentioned you earlier, after hotels, which was 53%. If we look to amount of nights spent by tourists in hotels and apartments, then in April it was 837,000, a little over 837,000 nights, which about 4 times more than in the same period of 2021. Now let's see statistics about May, and we can see that amount of tourists in this month was 308,000, which approximately the same as the previous month. But if we compare it to the same period of 2021, then growth was about 500% or 5 times. Number of nights that tourists spent were about 838,000, which is about 250% more than in the same period of 2021. 80% of the visitors were foreigners, 20% were Hungarian. In this month, hotels shares were 55%, apartments 35%. Next is June, and in this month, amount of tourists were 322,000, which about twice as much as in June 2021. And amount of nights were 893,000, which is about one and a half time more than in June 2021. 65% of tourists were foreigners, 35% Hungarian. Share of apartments in the market were 35%, hotels were 54%. In July, amount of tourists was 368,000, which again approximately twice as much as in July 2021. Amount of nights were over 1 million, to be precise 1,037,000, which is again almost twice as much as in the same period of 2021. 83% of visitors were foreigners and 17% were Hungarian. In this month, share of apartments were 29%, hotels were 54%. And the last month, what we have details and statistics available about is August 2022. And we can see that in August, there were about 449,000 tourists in Budapest, which is about 80% more than in August 2021. In this month, the amount of nights tourists have spent here were the highest. It was 1,155,000, which is 64% increase compared to the last year's August. 85% of visitors were foreigners and 15% were Hungarian. In this month, apartments shared about 29.5% of the market, hotels 54.5%. As we can see, Currently, short-term rental also doing very well here in Budapest, similarly to long-term rental. Overall, if we speak about current state of short-term rental in Budapest, then we can surely say that it recovered fully and as good as long-term rental after very rough 2020, the year of pandemic. We can see it based on both amount of tourists visiting Budapest and amount of nights that tourists spend here, and they both significantly higher than they were in 2021, not mentioning about 2020. When we speak here with you about short-term rental, we refer specifically to apartments in Budapest. And as we could see above, apartments are very popular among tourists in Budapest as a place where they usually want to stay, they would like to stay. They are not much behind hotels, and in average they share about 30% to 35% of the accommodation market. Nowadays, if you have an apartment in Budapest, and if it is in a relatively good area in the city, you can easily rent it to tourists and earn good profit. Exactly how much you can earn from short-term rental depends on location, how attractive the apartment is from tourists' perspective, and so on. And if there won't be any dramatic changes regarding COVID in upcoming months, we can expect at least the same level of success in the next year from short-term rental perspective as current year in Budapest. But more likely, we can expect even better year than current year because everyone missed traveling during 2020 and 2021 when there were a lot of restrictions and questions regarding COVID, and many simply didn't want to risk their health and didn't travel abroad. But they started to travel, for example, in 2022. So if you're thinking to purchase apartment specifically for short-term rental and you're still questioning if it is a good time right now for it in Budapest, then yes, it is absolutely a good time right now. Now let's speak about how you can start renting your apartment in Budapest to tourists. That is, how you can start short-term rental here. For example, let's say you want to buy an apartment specifically for this particular purpose, or you already have an apartment here and you want to rent it short term, you want to rent it to tourists. What to start with and what you should do first. Right now, the process of short-term rental legalization is quite simple here in Hungary. Basically, you have to register your apartment or your accommodation in centralized authority that, and if it fits all basic requirements, you will get your permission without any issue. But in order your request to be accepted, the most important requirement is that you have to have permission from the building where your apartment is located, so that this type of rental is allowed in that building. Because in Budapest, in some districts, the rules are more strict than in others, and in this kind of buildings, it's strictly forbidden to rent apartments short-term. These rules usually are made by common decision of residents in the building. So if the apartment is in this kind of building, then you can't rent it short-term. So if you want to buy an apartment and want to run short-term rental, then it's highly recommended to clear all questions regarding short-term rentals before purchasing that apartment. Other than that, if the apartment is in acceptable condition, then you will get your permission without any problems. That's it for today. Thank you for watching this video, and if you liked it, please consider to subscribe to my channel. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers!